Welcome, listeners. Find a comfortable place to settle in. Make sure the blinds are drawn tight. Double check that your front door is securely bolted. And let the outside world fade away. We spend our entire lives building fortresses. We buy homes, we rent apartments. We retreat into the spaces that belong exclusively to us. We lock our doors at night under the comforting illusion that turning a piece of metal in a deadbolt separates us from the chaos, the unpredictability, and the malice of the world outside. We convince ourselves that once we are inside, we are safe. But what happens when the fortress is compromised? What happens when you realize the threat isn't lurking out there in the dark woods or on a dangerous street corner, but is breathing the same air as you, standing in your hallway, or waiting in the shadows of your own basement? Tonight, we have 3 harrowing true accounts of the sanctuary being violated. These are the stories of individuals who discovered that the most terrifying place on earth can sometimes be your own home. The hands on the frame. For as long as I can remember, my ultimate fantasy was escape. While other kids in high school were dreaming of sports scholarships or backpacking across Europe, my ambitions were entirely focused on acquiring my own set of keys. Growing up, my childhood home was a toxic, suffocating environment. My father was a difficult, aggressive man, a temperament only amplified by the heavy drinking that consumed his weekends. My mother offered no refuge. The two of them were locked in a perpetual cycle of hostility, constantly butting heads, filling the house with a chaotic, heavy tension. As I navigated my teenage years, the reality of my living situation became an embarrassing burden. The concept of inviting a girl back to my house was completely out of the question. I couldn't subject anyone to that environment, and I couldn't subject myself to the anxiety of predicting my father's mood. I needed out. I needed a sanctuary. My escape route materialized when I turned 19. I was enrolled in a local commuter college. My parents refused to finance an out-of-state university experience, which meant I had to find housing nearby. I became a digital ghost, haunting low, scouring Craigslist, and refreshing Facebook Marketplace every single day. Finally, I struck gold. I found an affordable, remarkably decent rental apartment, and I signed the lease before the ink on the application was even dry. To understand the sheer terror of what happened to me, you have to understand the specific geometry of this apartment. When you unlocked the front door and stepped inside, you were greeted by an open-concept living and dining area. Adjacent to this space, separated by a single dividing wall, was a modest kitchen. To reach the apartment's only bedroom, you had to walk down a distinct, narrow hallway. Lining this hallway were 2 separate closets. One I converted into a pantry, the other used for general storage, followed by the door to the bathroom. At the very end of this corridor, acting as the terminus of the apartment, was the master bedroom. It was a fantastic space, large enough to easily swallow a queen-sized bed, a television, and a pair of heavy dressers, boasting 2 additional closets of its own. It was a budget-friendly paradise. It was mine. For the first few months, life was an absolute dream. I was independent, free from the shouting matches of my childhood, living exactly how I wanted. Then came a Friday night that would permanently alter my sense of safety. I was out on the town with a group of buddies, hopping between local spots, when we bumped into a group of girls from our college. Among them was a girl I had known peripherally for a while, though we had never really socialized one-on-one. For the sake of the story, we will call her Sammy. There was a mutual attraction, the drinks were flowing, and as the night began to wind down, I invited her back to my place. We retreated to my apartment, cracked open a few more drinks, and settled onto the living room couch to watch a movie. The atmosphere was incredibly relaxed. Sammy made it clear early on that she wasn't looking to rush into anything physical on our first real night hanging out, a boundary I completely respected. As the hours slipped by and the alcohol worked its heavy magic, we eventually relocated to the bedroom to finish the film. Exhaustion and intoxication took the wheel. Somewhere in the middle of the 3rd act, we both completely passed out. Night. My eyes fluttered open hours later. The apartment was submerged in the thick, oppressive silence of the deep night. What woke me was a sound. A soft, deliberate sound echoing from the hallway. Step, step, step. I rolled over, my head pounding with a dull ache. But the space beside me on the mattress was empty. The sheets were gold. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and peered out the open bedroom door, looking straight down the long, dark corridor. In the dim ambient light spilling from the street lamps outside, I could see Sammy in the living room. She was moving with exaggerated caution, quietly gathering her purse and her coat from the couch. I understood the calculus immediately. She had woken up, felt the creeping awkwardness of a morning after departure, and decided to execute a stealthy exit in the middle of the night. It was fine by me. I didn't want to force a sleepy, uncomfortable goodbye, so I remained perfectly still, watching from the shadows of the bedroom. I listened as she padded toward the front of the apartment. I heard the distinct, metallic click of the deadbolt disengaging, the creak of the hinges, and the heavy sigh of the front door. Just to be absolutely certain she hadn't simply gone to the kitchen, I softly called out her name into the dark apartment. Sammy. The silence that answered me was absolute. She was gone. I collapsed back onto the mattress, burying my face in the pillows. The alcohol still had its hooks in my system, dragging me back down into a deep, dreamless sleep within minutes. I don't know exactly how much time passed. Maybe slightly less. But I was violently ripped from my sleep by a sharp, jarring noise. It was a loud, definitive clatter, echoing from somewhere inside the apartment. I shot straight up in bed, my heart instantly hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. The lingering buzz of the alcohol evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. Sammy, I yelled out, my voice cracking slightly. The apartment was as silent as a tomb. A profound, paralyzing fear began to pool in my stomach. I was genuinely too terrified to throw off the covers and walk out into the hallway. My mind scrambled for a rational tether. Reaching for the nightstand, I grabbed my cell phone. The bright glare of the screen burned my eyes as I pulled up Sammy's contact and fired off a desperate text. Are you still in my house? I knew it was an absurd, cowardly thing to do, texting someone from the next room, but my survival instincts were screaming at me to stay put. I sat there, gripping the phone, staring out into the pitch-black hallway. Because of my laziness earlier, the bedroom door was still swung wide open, offering a direct view into the corridor. As my eyes desperately tried to adjust to the oppressive darkness, a shape began to materialize. My breathing grew shallow, ragged. I stared at the vertical wooden frame of my open bedroom door. There was a distortion in the shadows. Something pale, something completely out of place. It looked like something was gripping the wood. I was suffocating on my own terror. But a sudden, reckless surge of adrenaline forced my hand. Without looking away from the doorway, my thumb swiped down on the iPhone screen, pulling up the control center. My trembling finger hovered over the flashlight icon. I pressed it. A blinding, stark white beam of LED light cut through the darkness, illuminating the doorframe with terrifying clarity. It was not a trick of the light. It was not a hallucination born from alcohol. Wrapped tightly around the wooden frame of my bedroom door, stark white and starkly real, were two human hands. Someone was standing just out of sight in the hallway, gripping the molding, watching me in the dark. The moment the light hit the flesh, the hands reacted. The knuckles turned bone white as the grip tightened violently on the wood. And then, in a flash of sickening speed, the hands violently yanked backward, disappearing completely into the black void of the hallway. The scream that had been building in my lungs for 3 agonizing seconds finally tore its way out of my throat. It was a guttural, primal sound of absolute dread. Get out. I shrieked at the top of my lungs, my voice echoing off the walls. Get out! Get out! Driven by sheer, unadulterated panic, I threw myself out of the bed. I stood at the threshold of the hallway, the flashlight beam trembling violently in my grip. The corridor was empty. I slammed my hand against the wall, flipping the master light switch. The hallway flooded with harsh, artificial light. I stood there gasping for air, forcing myself to listen over the roar of my own heartbeat. Silence. It took me several excruciating minutes to build the psychological fortitude to move. Holding my heavy smartphone out in front of me like a loaded weapon, I began a tactical sweep of my own home. I approached the pantry. I yanked the door open. Empty. I moved to the storage closet. Empty. I kicked open the bathroom door, sweeping behind the shower curtain. Empty. I crept into the open living and dining area. The space offered zero concealment. It was clear. Finally, I rounded the dividing wall into the kitchen, flipping the switch and bathing the final room in blinding light. I dropped to my knees, checking beneath the small table. I even ripped open the large, lower kitchen cabinets, fully expecting a frantic intruder to come bursting out. Nothing. The apartment was entirely devoid of life. I sprinted to the front entrance and threw the deadbolt, locking myself inside. As the heavy lock clicked into place, a horrifying realization washed over me. When Sammy left, I had heard the door open, but I had never actually heard it close. I leaned against the locked door, my hands shaking so violently, I could barely operate my phone. I dialed Sammy's number, calling her over and over, until she finally groggily answered. She sounded exhausted, deeply confused by the barrage of calls. Were you just in my house? I demanded, my voice tight and breathless. No. She mumbled. I left an hour ago. I couldn't sleep. Why? I couldn't bring myself to explain the horror of the last 10 minutes. Wait. My bad. I thought I heard a noise. I hung up the phone. Desperate for a tether to reality, I dialed my best friend, spamming his phone until he answered, slurring his words. I rapid-fired the entire nightmare into his ear, the noise, the flashlight, the pale hands gripping the wood. He listened patiently, then delivered a heavy sigh. He pointed out that I was slurring my own words. I was exhausted, sleep-deprived, and still heavily under the influence of alcohol. He calmly, rationally explained that the brain can conjure terrifying illusions in the hazy space between deep sleep and waking panic. It was a hallucination, he insisted, a mid-sleep terror brought on by booze and shadows. Sitting alone in the bright kitchen, his logic began to penetrate my panic. It made a terrifying amount of sense. After all, the apartment was empty, and the door was now locked. I managed a weak, nervous laugh, apologized profusely for waking him, and ended the call. I walked back to my bedroom, shut the door firmly, locked it, and eventually managed to exhaust myself back into a fitful, uneasy sleep. The next morning, the harsh light of day stripped the apartment of its nighttime menace. I conducted another thorough sweep. The space was undeniably secure. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was missing. I breathed a massive sigh of relief, chuckling at my own drunken paranoia. As I walked back to my bedroom to get dressed, I paused. I looked at the wooden door frame, right at the exact height where I had witnessed the terrifying illusion the night before. My heart completely stopped beating. The blood drained from my face, and a wave of severe dizziness forced me to lean against the drywall. Pressed clearly into the surface of the wood, in the exact, precise position where I had seen the pale skin gripping the frame, were the distinct, undeniable smudges of human fingerprints. It was not a trick of the light. It was not a hallucination. The hands had been real. I immediately grabbed my phone and snapped a high-resolution photograph of the evidence, an image that still sits chillingly in my iCloud storage to this very day. In a state of shock, I called my father, detailing the nightmare. His response was characteristically blunt and devoid of comfort. He berated me for my sheer stupidity in failing to lock the deadbolt the moment I knew someone had exited the apartment. He told me that since nothing was stolen and my throat wasn't slit, I should consider it the most valuable lesson I would ever learn. As infuriating as his lack of empathy was, every word he spoke was true. That was the most terrifying part. I will never know who crossed the threshold of my apartment that night. I will never know how long they stood in my pitch-black hallway, listening to me sleep. And I will never understand why they chose to execute the single most psychologically horrifying act imaginable before vanishing into the night. I spent the remainder of my lease triple-checking the locks. The moment the contract expired, I packed my life into boxes, upgraded to a secure building, and never, ever looked back. The call from inside the house. For most kids, the family home is a bustling hub of activity. It's a place of constant motion, noise, and parental supervision. But my parents' house was a different beast entirely. It never truly felt like a traditional home. My father was a corporate ghost, constantly traveling for work, his life measured in airport terminals and hotel rooms. My mother was equally elusive. She possessed an incredibly active social life, frequently staying out late with friends, or spending the weekend at my aunt's house. She often wouldn't come home at all. I know it sounds dysfunctional to an outside observer, but it wasn't malicious abandonment. My parents simply valued their absolute freedom and independence, a realization they likely came to only after I was born. As an only child, this meant that from the age of 16 onward, I essentially operated as a solitary tenant in a very large, very empty house. I ate dinner alone. I navigated the weekends in silence. At the time, I viewed it as the ultimate teenage luxury. I had a sprawling estate completely to myself, free from curfews, nagging, and the irritating presence of siblings. I could blast music, invite friends over, and talk to girls on the phone deep into the night without fear of eavesdropping. It was total, unadulterated freedom. Even when I turned 19 and enrolled in a local commuter college, the dynamic remained identical. If anything, my parents were absent even more frequently. I became the de facto caretaker of the property. I knew every square inch of the place. I knew the specific groan of the staircase, the rattle of the Vox system, and the heavy settle of the roof. It wasn't a creepy, drafty house that set your nerves on edge. It was just large, old, and full of character. Then came the night that forever shattered my comfort in isolation. My father was, predictably, out of town on a business trip. My mother had been discussing a massive family gathering at my aunt's house all week, declaring she would simply stay overnight rather than navigate the late-night doctor back. "It's just you tonight," she told me before walking out the door. It was a redundant statement. I was entirely unfazed. The evening progressed through its standard, solitary rituals. I cooked a massive dinner, sprawled out on the living room couch to watch television, and eventually, around 11, I decided to migrate upstairs. The layout of the second floor was a long, straight corridor. At the top of the stairs sat a small landing. To the immediate right was my parents' sprawling master bedroom. Continuing down the hall, you passed the main bathroom and a linen closet, until finally reaching my bedroom at the absolute dead end of the corridor. I retreated to my room, climbed into bed, and cracked open my laptop to fall down a YouTube rabbit hole. I intentionally left my bedroom door swung wide open. It was a habit drilled into me by my parents, a mandate to remain orally aware of the house, to listen for breaking glass, or unexpected entry. But honestly, I preferred the door open because it allowed the ambient noise of the house to drift in. The absolute, dead silence of a massive empty house can be deafening, so I had intentionally left the living room television on downstairs. The volume dialed low, providing a faint, comforting murmur of background noise. Exhaustion eventually caught up with me, I slammed the laptop shut, rolled over in the dark, and began mindlessly scrolling through my phone. Roughly an hour passed in the quiet darkness. Suddenly, the harsh vibration of a phone call shattered the silence of the bedroom. I lifted the device, the bright screen illuminating the dark. The caller display was blank, offering only 3 ominous words. Wait, no caller ID. I stared at the screen, my brow furrowing in confusion. I had never received an anonymous call before. To receive one so late at night felt instantly, inherently sketchy. I let the phone vibrate until it sent the caller to voicemail. 10 seconds later, the screen lit up again. No caller ID. The persistence triggered a shift in my logic. If someone was calling back immediately, perhaps it was an emergency. A friend in trouble, a family member with a dead battery. Besides, I reasoned, it was merely a phone call. If it was a prank, I could simply sever the connection. I swiped the green icon and brought the speaker to my ear. Hello? I asked. There was no immediate response. No heavy breathing. No static. No voice. For a fleeting second, I assumed it was an automated spam call, a machine pinging random numbers to verify active lines. But then, I began to perceive a sound. It was faint, muffled, and entirely out of context. It took my tired brain a few agonizing seconds to process the auditory information coming through the tiny speaker. It sounded exactly like a television program playing in the background. My heart skipped a beat. A cold, creeping unease began to slither through my veins, because beneath the audio coming through the phone, I could still hear the faint, ambient murmur of my own television playing downstairs in the living room. I tightened my grip on the phone. Hello? I demanded, my voice sharper this time. Silence. The person on the other end made absolutely no attempt to speak. They were simply existing on the line, letting the background noise bleed through the microphone. Then, the horrifying reality of the situation locked into place, sending a violent shockwave of pure adrenaline through my nervous system. I sat bolt upright in bed. The audio playing through the phone wasn't random. It wasn't a similar channel. It was perfectly, terrifyingly synchronized. Every laugh track, every spike in dialogue, every musical cue echoing faintly from the first floor of my house was simultaneously blasting directly into my ear through the cellular connection. There was zero delay. It was a flawless, real-time mirror. The implication was an absolute nightmare. The only physical way this was possible was if the person calling my cell phone was currently standing in my living room. The human mind is a master of denial. I desperately tried to construct a rational, non-lethal explanation. It's a glitch, I told myself. The phone's microphone is somehow looping the room audio back into the earpiece. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a sadistic friend standing outside the living room window, pressing their phone against the glass. But, as I strained my ears, listening intently to the agonizing silence between the television dialogue, the denial evaporated. The acoustic resonance was unmistakable. The color wasn't outside. The acoustics were interior. They were standing inside the walls of my home. I slowly slid out of bed, my bare feet silent on the floorboards, and crept to the open doorway of my bedroom. I listened to the house. I listened to the phone. I was 1,000,000% certain. The audio was identical. In a moment of sheer, reckless panic, fueled by the desperate hope that this was a cruel joke orchestrated by someone I knew, I screamed into the dark hallway. Who's down there? A sharp click echoed in my ear. But the line went dead. The caller had hung up the moment I yelled. Wait, my mouth went completely dry, tasting of copper and fear. I couldn't call the number back. I was completely cut off. I stood paralyzed at the threshold of my bedroom, staring down the black corridor toward the staircase. The faint glow of the television flickered against the walls downstairs. Then, the house spoke. Creak. It was the distinct, agonizing groan of a hardwood floorboard yielding to the heavy, concentrated pressure of a human foot. But what completely shattered my sanity, what erased any lingering doubt of a technical glitch, was the sound that followed. Someone downstairs cleared their throat. It was a wet, deliberate, profoundly human sound. Pure survival instinct hijacked my body. I leapt backward into my bedroom, violently pulled the heavy wooden door shut, and threw the deadbolt with a resounding clack. My mind raced. Wait. Was this a test? Was my father trying to gauge my response to a simulated home invasion? Or perhaps it was my eccentric Uncle T, playing a deeply twisted prank. With trembling fingers, I dialed my father's number. It rang out to voicemail. It was nearly midnight. He was likely dead to the world in a hotel room hundreds of miles away. I called 3 more times in rapid succession. Nothing. Desperate, I dialed my Uncle T. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Why are you calling so late?" he grumbled. "Listen to me. This might sound crazy," I stammered, my voice shaking uncontrollably. "Are you downstairs at my house right now?" I will never forget the shift in his tone. The grogginess instantly vanished, replaced by sharp, alarmed confusion. "Steve." "Wait, what the hell are you talking about?" I rapidly unloaded the nightmare, the cinched phone call, the footsteps, the throat clearing. Uncle T immediately recognized the severity of the situation. "That sounds exactly like some twisted trick your father would pull," he muttered. But before we could formulate a plan, the phone pressed against my ear began to vibrate violently. I pulled the screen away from my face. No call read. "Uncle T, wait, stay on the line. Don't hang up," I begged, my voice cracking. "I have to put you on hold. They're calling back." I tapped the screen, accepting the anonymous call. "Hello," I whispered. The line was dead silent, but this time, the television audio was gone. Instead, the speaker broadcast a sound that made my blood run absolutely cold. I heard the rhythmic, heavy thud of footsteps. I wasn't just hearing them through the phone. I was hearing them in the physical space of my house. The digital audio from the speaker perfectly matched the terrifying reality echoing outside my bedroom door. The intruder was walking down the second-floor hallway. They were approaching my room. I prayed with every fiber of my being that my father was about to announce his presence. The brass stone above my bedroom began to slowly, deliberately jiggle. Whoever was standing on the other side of the wood gripped the handle and violently shoved their weight against the door. I thanked every god in existence for the heavy, antique construction of the door and the solid steel deadbolt. The frame groaned, but it held firm. The sound of the impact on the door echoed simultaneously through the phone pressed to my ear. Light. Then, the intruder knocked. 3 slow, methodical raps against the wood. A sudden, desperate strategy formed in my mind. My finger slammed the merge calls button on my screen. The moment the lines connected, I screamed into the microphone, directing my voice entirely at my uncle. "It's not Dad. Get over here right now. The person in the house is on the phone with us." The declaration shattered whatever sleep was left in my uncle's brain. He erupted into an absolute fury. "I'm coming right now. You sick piece of shit." He roared into the phone, his voice a terrifying boom of aggression. The threat worked. The anonymous caller immediately severed the connection. A second later, the heavy footsteps retreated rapidly from my door, thundering back down the hallway toward the stairs. My uncle barked a command to stay locked in the room and keep the line open. He lived in the same town, but the 7-minute drive from his house to mine stretched into an agonizing eternity. I was a skinny 19-year-old kid. I had no illusions of being an action hero. I sat on the floor, gripping a heavy lamp, waiting for the door to splinter. Finally, the roar of my uncle's truck engine echoed in the driveway. I heard the heavy thud of the front door opening, followed by his booming voice screaming my name from the bottom of the stairs. The relief was physical, a heavy weight lifting off my chest. I threw the deadbolt, sprinted out of the room, and scrambled down the stairs. Together, we immediately dialed 911. While we waited for the sirens, we conducted a rapid, tense sweep of the first floor. The television was still flickering in the living room. Nothing appeared stolen. But as we entered the kitchen, the reality of the intrusion was laid bare. The large kitchen window, facing the dark backyard, was forced completely open. The screen had been violently removed, leaving a gaping hole large enough for a grown man to easily crawl through. When the police arrived, they executed a tactical, room-by-room clearance of the property, demanding we trail safely behind them. The house was entirely clear. The phantom had vanished into the night. As the adrenaline began to subside, the officers debriefed us in the kitchen. They asked to examine my call log. When they saw the persistent no-caller ID entries, one veteran officer offered a sliver of hope. Even when they blocked the ID, he explained, we can subpoena the telecom providers and pull the raw outing data. It takes a few days, but we can trace it. My uncle refused to leave my side. He slept on the living room couch that night, and we left every single light in the house blazing until dawn, like terrified children holding back the dark. 3 days later, the detective called. That they had traced the signal. The number didn't belong to a nameless drifter or a random serial killer. It belonged to an old acquaintance from my high school. We weren't close friends, nor were we enemies. We were simply two kids who had crossed paths enough times for him to possess my cell phone number and know the location of my parents' house. I hadn't seen or spoken to him in years. The police asked if I wanted to be present during the preliminary questioning. My uncle and I drove to the address provided by the precinct. When the suspect's father opened the front door to find a pair of uniformed officers and his son's old classmate on the porch, he looked bewildered. He immediately summoned the boy down the stairs. When my old acquaintance saw us, the blood visibly drained from his face. His eyes darted nervously between the badges on my face. The lead officer didn't mince words. He point blank accused the boy of making the phone calls and breaking into my home. The boy adamantly, frantically denied it. He immediately launched into a frantic alibi. He claimed his cell phone had been stolen at a chaotic house party several days prior. He insisted he had never recovered it. Why didn't you file a police report for the stolen device? The officer pressed, his tone dripping with skepticism. The boy simply shrugged, a gesture of forced nonchalance that felt entirely artificial. I figured it was gone. I was just going to upgrade and buy a new one anyway. The officers took his statement, informed him they would be following up with his telecom provider, and we left. His father had stood silently in the foyer the entire time, watching the interrogation with an unreadable expression. There was no dramatic arrest, no cinematic confession. The legal threshold for a conviction was simply to hide a clear based on a pinged cell tower and a convenient alibi. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind tortured me with the implications. The boy's sheer, visceral panic when he opened the door. Was it the natural terror of an innocent kid faced with the police, or was it the crushing realization of a predator caught in a lie? If his alibi was true, the alternative was infinitely more terrifying. It meant that some unknown, nameless individual had specifically targeted him, stolen his phone at a crowded party, and combed through his contacts just to find my number, call me, and break into my house. I don't know which reality is worse, but I do know that whenever my phone rings with an unlisted number, my blood still runs cold. The Black Mass. Our final tale tonight explores a fundamental shift in reality. It is a story about how a place of comfort, camaraderie, and safety can transform into a theater of absolute horror in the blink of an eye. This nightmare unfolded in the years immediately following college. I was 23, navigating the chaotic transition into adulthood with my usual crew of friends. Our weekend ritual was practically sacred. Gather at Cody's house, heavily pregame, and hit the local bar scene. Cody's house was the designated staging ground for two vital reasons. First, his parents were incredibly laid back, operating with a detached, as long as you're safe mentality. Second, and most importantly, his house featured an expansive, fully finished basement. It was a subterranean paradise where we could be as loud as we wanted without waking the adults to floors above. It was a standard Saturday night. The roster consisted of the core four: Cody, Randy, Jake, and myself. We congregated in the basement, finalized our designated Uber account for the evening, and headed out into the night. The hours bled together in a haze of loud music and cheap alcohol. We bounced from sticky floor dive bars to overcrowded dance clubs. By the time the night began to violently wind down, exhaustion had firmly taken hold. Randy and Jake were fueled by some manic second wind energy and decided to keep the party rolling. Cody and I, however, were completely spent. Cody hailed an Uber, and we retreated to the quiet sanctuary of his house. Knowing I was in no condition to navigate my way back to my own apartment, Cody graciously offered me the pull-out couch in the basement. We trudged down the wooden stairs, the heavy silence of the sleeping house enveloping us. Cody helped me wrestle the heavy mattress out of the couch frame. To wind down, we fired up the PlayStation and booted up a game of Madden. I have always been aggressively terrible at sports games. In my heavily intoxicated state, my performance was atrocious. Cody absolutely dismantled me on the digital gridiron. Humiliated and exhausted, I tossed the controller onto the coffee table and declared defeat. I just wanted to surrender to sleep, hoping to sleep off the heavy fog of alcohol before the inevitable crushing hangover could take root. Cody killed the console, wished me a good night, and trudged up the stairs. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, sealing me in the basement. The darkness was not absolute. It was a murky, textured gloom. The space was illuminated by a constellation of tiny, artificial stars, the harsh red numbers of the cable box clock, the piercing crimson standby light of the massive television, and the sickly, pale green glow emanating from the glass door of a Heineken mini fridge humming in the far corner of the room. The low, mechanical hum of that fridge acted as a bizarrely comforting white noise machine. I pulled the heavy blankets up to my chin, closed my eyes, and instantly plummeted into the heavy, dreamless oblivion of an alcohol-induced sleep. I don't know what time my eyes snapped open. I just knew the night was still holding court, somewhere in that desolate, liminal space between 3, light, 0 and 4, light, 0 m. I woke up with a singular, agonizing sensation. My mouth was a desert. The alcohol had completely dehydrated my system. My tongue felt like heavy sandpaper scraping against the roof of my mouth. It was a physical, demanding thirst. I cursed my drunken stupidity for failing to bring a glass of water downstairs. The physical agony of the hangover was wrestling with the profound, leaden weight of my exhaustion. I desperately did not want to move. I lay there for several minutes, staring at the ceiling, trying to will the thirst away. Defeated, I finally rolled over, casting a bleary, hopeful glance toward the green glow of the Heineken fridge across the room, praying a rogue bottle of water might be hidden among the beer. It was empty of anything hydrating. As I resigned myself to the agonizing prospect of climbing the stairs to the kitchen, my gaze drifted lazily away from the fridge, tracking across the deep shadows of the basement. My eyes settled on the far, opposite corner of the room. My brain instantly rejected the visual information it was receiving. I blinked hard, attributing the anomaly to the darkness and the lingering haze of intoxication. There was a massive, pitch-black shape occupying the corner. It was an imposing, solid mass of shadow that stood in stark contrast to the ambient gray of the room. I frantically searched my memory, trying to recall the layout of the basement. Was there a standing coach rack? A stack of moving boxes? A heavy punching bag? I stared into the gloom, waiting for my pupils to fully dilate and decode the shape. But as the seconds ticked by, the horrifying reality of the silhouette snapped into agonizing focus. The shape was not a piece of furniture. It possessed shoulders. It possessed a head. And then, the black mass shifted to full-eyed might. It was a microscopic movement, a subtle readjustment of weight, but it was entirely, terrifyingly human. Someone was standing in the corner of the pitch-black basement, perfectly still, watching me sleep. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the terror that flooded my system is indescribable. Every muscle in my body locked into a rigid paralysis. I desperately fought the primal, overwhelming urge to scream at the top of my lungs. I knew instinctively that it wasn't Cody. The towering height and sheer physical bulk of the shadow dwarfed my friend. I was trapped in the basement with a predator. Panic is a death sentence in a confined space. I forced my brain to execute a rapid, desperate psychological calculus. If I screamed, if I leapt out of the bed and bolted for the stairs, the massive figure would inevitably intercept me. I had to engineer a seamless, flawless deception. I had to convince the intruder that I was completely blind to their presence. After 2 agonizing, endless minutes of feigning sleep, I executed my performance. I let out a loud, groggy, highly exaggerated yawn. I stretched my arms high above my head, twisting my torso, playing the role of the oblivious, hungover house guest perfectly. I began muttering to myself, my voice thick with sleep. Damn it, I grumbled, rubbing my eyes. So thirsty. Why didn't I grab water? I threw the blankets off and swung my legs onto the cold carpet. Every movement was slow, deliberate, entirely devoid of panic. I stood up. I was now exposed. I began the agonizing march toward the staircase. The geography of the room demanded that to reach the stairs, I had to walk closer to the shadowed corner where the giant mass stood waiting. The tension was a physical pressure, crushing my chest. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, my peripheral vision screaming at the dark shape looming just feet away. The moment I pivoted right to face the base of the stairs was the most terrifying split-second of my existence. I fully expected massive hands to violently seize me from the dark. But the hands never came. I placed my foot on the first wooden reed. I forced myself to maintain a slow, groggy, measured pace. Do not run. Do not run. I repeated the mantra in my head with every agonizing step upward. I reached the midpoint of the staircase. The safety of the door was just a few feet away. The human urge to verify survival overpowered my discipline. I couldn't stop myself. I cast a swift, terrifying glance back down over my shoulder into the basement. My heart completely stopped. The corner was empty. The black mass was no longer hiding in the shadows. The towering figure had moved with terrifying, absolute silence, and was now standing at the very bottom of the staircase, staring directly up at me. The illusion of safety shattered. I stumbled, my shin violently cracking against a wooden step, but the pain didn't register. I erupted into a frantic, desperate sprint, clawing my way up the remaining stairs. I threw my body through the doorway, spun around, and violently slammed the heavy wooden door shut. I didn't stop to lock it. I didn't stop to breathe. I sprinted up the second flight of stairs, tearing down the hallway and bursting into Cody's bedroom. I grabbed his shoulders, violently shaking him from his sleep. Cody, wake. There's someone in the basement. Get your dad now. Cody blinked in groggy confusion, but the sheer, unadulterated panic in my voice mobilized him instantly. As we scrambled out of his room, a deafening, violent slam echoed from the first floor, shaking the drywall. "See!" I shrieked, pointing toward the stairs. We burst into the master bedroom, screaming the situation to Cody's father. The older man didn't hesitate. He vaulted out of bed, bypassing questions, and charged down both flights of stairs like a man going to war. We trailed nervously behind him. When we reached the main floor, the reality of the situation was chillingly clear. The heavy basement door, which I had violently slammed shut moments ago, was standing wide open. And across the kitchen, the heavy exterior back door of the house was also flung wide open, letting the cold night air pour into the home. Cody's father barked a command to call 911. While Cody relayed the nightmare to the dispatcher, the three of us cautiously descended into the basement. It was empty. We cleared the backyard, sweeping the flashlight beams across the grass and peering over the fences into the neighboring properties. The night had swallowed the intruder whole. It took the police 15 agonizing minutes to arrive. They swept the property, took our frantic statements, and filed a formal report. The commotion drew the attention of the neighbors, who emerged onto their porches in the early morning chill, asking if everyone was safe. The adrenaline crash was brutal. I was completely sober, violently shivering, and desperate to escape the property. The moment the flashing red and blue lights of the cruisers faded down the street, I ordered an Uber. I flatly refused Cody's offer to drive me home. I just wanted to be locked inside my own apartment. I worried for the safety of Cody's family that night, but the truth is, I never slept in that basement again. We still hung out there occasionally, in the safety of the daylight, surrounded by friends. But the atmosphere of the room was forever poisoned. That the sanctuary had been violated, and every single time I sat on that couch, my eyes would involuntarily lock onto that dark corner, my mind replaying the terrifying image of the silent, towering black mass waiting in the dark. Thank you for tuning in tonight. The stories we explored are a dark reminder that the walls we build around ourselves are ultimately fragile, that true terror doesn't respect a property line, and that sometimes the monsters are already inside the house. Like, lock your doors, check your corners, and I will see you all again very soon. Welcome back, listeners. Take a moment to think about the place where you feel the safest. Maybe it's your bedroom, doors locked, the soft glow of a bedside lamp pushing back the dark. Maybe it's a remote hiking trail where the noise of the world melts away. Or maybe it's in the presence of your own family, insulated by blood and history. We construct these invisible fortresses around ourselves, don't we? We build them out of locks, and routines, and blind trust. But what happens when you realize those walls have always been made of glass? Tonight, we have an episode that dives deep into that exact, terrifying revelation. We're going to explore 3 distinct accounts, 3 different lives, that all share one chilling commonality: the sudden, paralyzing realization that they were not alone. Like, there are no supernatural cop-outs here, no ghosts to blame, just the cold, hard reality of human obsession, the terror of the unseen, and the sinister things that happen just out of our line of sight. Settle in, check your locks, and whatever you do, don't look out the window. Tale 1. The Fishbowl. Our first account comes from a 22-year-old listener, freshly out of college, standing on the precipice of adult life. But the shadow looming over them doesn't come from the future. It stretches all the way back into their childhood. Imagine a picture-perfect, quintessential suburban neighborhood. The kind with manicured lawns, friendly waves across driveways, and streetlights that cast a warm, amber glow on the asphalt. For nearly 2 decades, our narrator's family has lived in a beautiful 3-story home in a highly desirable area. To understand the geography of this nightmare, you only need to visualize 2 rooms. The narrator's bedroom sits on the 2nd floor, anchored by a large window looking directly down at the street. White, 1 floor above, on the 3rd story, is their father's home office. It too possesses a single window overlooking that same stretch of road. Two eyes, essentially, staring out into the dark. For the longest time, they believed those windows were for looking out. They didn't realize someone was using them to look in. The narrator writes to us today because of an event that occurred just last week, an event so shattering that it reconstructed their entire life. They are now unequivocally, 100% convinced that their family is the target of a sinister, methodical, and inexplicable surveillance campaign. In the most terrifying part, it has been happening for over a decade. We have to rewind, go back 10 years. Our narrator is just a kid in middle school, navigating the weekend routine. It's a quiet Saturday or Sunday morning. They're padding down the stairs for breakfast, the house wrapped in the soft, lazy quiet of the weekend, when they hear the hushed, tense voices of their parents spilling from the kitchen. You know that specific tone parents use when they think children aren't listening. That low, urgent register that signals something is deeply wrong. The narrator freezes on the stairs. They can't hear every word, but they catch their father saying with unmistakable dread that it happened again. When the young narrator walks into the kitchen and asks what's wrong, the parents deflect. They plaster on fake smiles and change the subject. It would be over a year before the parents spoke of it directly, but siblings talk. A few days later, the older brother spilled the secret. The father's a lawyer. If you know anything about the legal profession, you know it demands blood, sweat, and late nights. It was common for him to bring the crushing weight of his caseload home, retreating to that third-floor office to grind away at documents while the rest of the neighborhood slept. On the night before that hushed kitchen conversation, the father was at his desk. It was 2:00 a.m. The house was dead quiet. The street outside was a tomb. Around midnight, he had rubbed his tired eyes, glanced out the third-story window, and noticed a vehicle. A heavy, hulking Chevy Suburban. But it was driving. Right. It was crawling. The father estimated it was moving at no more than 5 miles per hour. It looked as though the driver had simply taken their foot off the pedals entirely. Like letting the vehicle's idle carry it forward, like a predator stalking through tall grass. The father watched it slide silently out of view. Strange, sure, but it's late. People get lost. He went back to his briefs. A little while later, movement caught his eye again. The exact same Suburban. Only this time, it was rolling down the street in the opposite direction. Just as slow, just as quiet. And then, it stopped. Right across the street, dead center in front of their house. The father sat in his dark office, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs, staring down at the metal box. He waited for a door to open. He waited for a teenager to hop out, or someone looking for an address, or even a drunk driver pulling over to sleep it off. He watched for several agonizing minutes. Night. No movement. No doors opening. Just a heavy, idling machine sitting in the dark, pointed at their lives. Eventually, logic and exhaustion won out over fear. The father Keldon spent his entire night staring at a parked car. He had deadlines. He forced himself to look back at his paperwork, though his eyes darted to the window every few minutes. The car never moved. What? No one ever got out. At around 2, the sheer weight of exhaustion pulled the father under, and he fell asleep right there at his desk. Pause. He woke up at 5:30 in the morning. The sky was just beginning to bleed a bruised purple. He blinked the sleep from his eyes, groggy and disoriented, and looked out the window. The Suburban was still there, exactly where it had stopped. It hadn't moved an inch in 3.5 hours. The father was so violently shocked he actually believed he was caught in a waking nightmare. What had the occupant been doing in that pitch-black cabin for nearly 4 hours? Just staring at the house. The vehicle finally S-linked away just before the sun breached the horizon. Wait, The father never went back to sleep. And worse, he eventually confessed to the family that this wasn't the first time he'd seen cars pacing their street in the dead of night. It was just the most undeniable. But humans are resilient creatures, often to our own detriment. We rationalize. The family chalked it up to a bizarre coincidence. A weary traveler resting in a random neighborhood. At worst, a burglar casing the block. They moved on. Fast forward a few years. Our narrator is 15 now, a sophomore in high school. They're in that second-floor bedroom, the one right below the dad's office. It's late at night, and they're sitting at their desk, which is pressed right up against the window facing the street. They have their headphones securely on, fully immersed in making music beats, completely detached from the sensory reality of the world outside. Suddenly, a flicker. Just a sharp, unnatural pulse of light catching the corner of their eye. The narrator pulls one headphone off. They peer out into the suburban gloom. Creeping down the street, moving with that same sickeningly slow crawl, is a convoy. At least 3 cars, moving in a tight, deliberate formation. But it's not the speed that sends a spike of ice water into the teenager's veins. It's the light. The occupants of the vehicles are holding high-powered flashlights out of their rolled-down windows, sweeping the blinding white beams meticulously across the facades of the houses. The narrator watches, paralyzed by a confusing dread, as the lead car's beam washes over the neighbor's property, illuminating the brick, the windows, the lawn. And then, the beam shifts. It turns toward their house. Instinct takes over. The narrator violently throws themselves to the floor, tucking their body tightly beneath the windowsill, their heart hammering violently against the floorboards. 2 seconds later, the bedroom is flooded with blinding white light. The beam crawls across the ceiling, searching, probing, dragging its invasive gaze through the teenager's sanctuary. It holds there for a terrifying couple of seconds. Then, darkness returns. The narrator stays huddled on the floor, holding their breath for a full 20 seconds. When they finally dare to peek over the sill, the convoy is at the end of the block, slowly making a turn, melting away into the night. The family reaction the next morning was swift. A collective agreement was reached. Thugs, professional burglars casing the neighborhood for empty targets. It's the easiest pill to swallow, isn't it? Greed makes sense. You can fight greed. The dad installed drink cameras immediately. He mounted motion sensor floodlights and security cameras in the backyard. The fortress was fortified. But a fortress only works if the enemy is on the outside. A few years slip by. The narrator's dad hires a landscaping crew to do some routine maintenance in the backyard. One afternoon, a contractor approaches the dad, looking utterly perplexed. In his dirt-stained hands, he holds a small black object he found meticulously tucked deep inside the dense foliage of a bush near the fence line. It was a camera. Tiny, covert, no bigger than an electronic car key. The dad examines it. It's battery-powered, though the battery has been dead for God knows how long. He cracks it open. No SIM card. No micro SD card. No local storage whatsoever. But let that sink in for a second. If a hidden camera isn't recording data onto a memory card, what is it doing? It's streaming. It's pushing a live video feed to a nearby receiver. The dad's blood runs cold. The most logical, horrifying conclusion is that someone had planted that lens in the bushes, aiming it at the private life of his family, and then parked a vehicle close enough to intercept the live broadcast. Watching them barbecue. Watching them let the dog out. Watching them live. Until the battery simply gave out, and they abandoned it. The dad tore through months of his own security footage, desperately searching for the moment the predator breached the yard. Nothing. He grilled the narrator's friends, convinced it was a sick teenage prank. Nobody confessed. They called the police, filed the reports, but what could the cops do? The family's security was already state-of-the-art. They had reached the limit of how much they could protect themselves. Deep breath. Years pass again. The anxiety dulls, as it always does. The house immediately next door goes up for sale and is snapped up almost instantly. The neighborhood is highly coveted, so the quick turnover isn't odd. But the new occupants are. It's a youngish couple, no kids, in a massive, multi-bedroom family home. Our observant narrator quickly picks up on a bizarre habit. Frequently, either late at night or very early in the morning, they catch the couple standing at their top floor window, staring, not out at the street, staring directly down into the narrator's yard. At first, the narrator tries to rationalize. They have a home office up there. They're just looking up from their desks. But they are always standing, positioned deliberately at the glass, studying the property line. One evening, the narrator is out walking the family dog. The street is quiet. As they pass the neighbor's house, they glance toward the large, illuminated bay window of the neighbor's kitchen. It's lit up like a stage. The couple is sitting at the dining table, but for the first time since they moved in, they aren't alone. Sitting with them is a third person. The man. His features are incredibly distinct, the kind of face a composites sketch artist dreams of. He is completely bald, heavily muscled, and he possesses the thickest, most intense eyebrows the narrator has ever seen. The three of them are engaged in quiet conversation. The narrator lingers for just a second too long. As if sensing the eyes on them, the neighbor's wife abruptly stands up. She doesn't look out the window. She doesn't make eye contact. She just strides purposefully to the glass and aggressively yanks the heavy curtains shut, sealing the room in darkness. The narrator is left standing on the sidewalk with the dog, a cold knot forming in their stomach. She knew she was being watched. Now, listeners, if the story ended here, you might say, well, they have creepy neighbors. It happens. But it doesn't end here. It ends last week. A few weeks ago, the family traveled across the world to Paris. The older brother was preparing to propose to his longtime girlfriend, and both families had flown out to celebrate. It was supposed to be a joyous, insulated, perfect vacation. A few days into the trip, the entire group is crowded into a booth at a random, bustling Parisian bar. The drinks are flowing, the conversation is loud and happy. The narrator is nursing a drink, letting the noise wash over them, their eyes lazily scanning the crowded room. Their gaze lands on a man sitting alone in a booth across the bar. HES casually sipping a drink, his eyes surveying the crowd. The narrator's brain misfires. A jolt of recognition hits them, followed immediately by fierce, desperate denial. It's him. The bald, muscular man with the thick eyebrows. The man from the neighbor's kitchen table. No, the narrator thinks. Impossible. Statistically impossible. We are in Paris. We are at a random bar, on a random street, thousands of miles from home. But the longer they stare, the more the denial crumbles. It is him. And then, the man stops scanning the room. He slowly turns his head, and he looks directly at our narrator. Across the smoky, noisy room, the air between them turns to ice. The narrator describes the moment vividly. He knew I knew, and he knew that I knew he knew. The silence between them in that crowded bar was deafening. Without breaking eye contact, the man calmly sets his unfinished drink down. He doesn't ask for a check. He slides out of the booth, turns his back, and disappears into the throng of bodies. The narrator scrambles out of their booth, heart threatening to crack their ribs, shoving past patrons to follow him. But HES gone. swallowed by the city. The narrator returns to their family, shaking, trying to force the lid back on their sanity. A coincidence, they chant internally. The most insane, bizarre coincidence in human history. HES just on vacation too. 2 days later. Right? Broad daylight. Like, the families are walking through a crowded tourist plaza. The sun is shining. People are laughing. Like, the narrator glances over the sea of heads. 50 feet away, standing perfectly still, is the man. The coincidence theory shatters into a million jagged pieces. The man is holding a high-end, professional camera. He has it raised to his face. And while there is a famous Parisian monument directly behind the family, like, the lens is undeniably dead center focused on them. The narrator watches, paralyzed, as the man lowers the camera, gives one last look, turns a corner, and vanishes. Like, the dam breaks. The narrator finally tells their parents everything. The terror is so contagious, so incredibly real, that the father actually suggests abandoning the trip and flying home immediately. Like, they don't, but the rest of the vacation is spent looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows. When they finally return home, the father frantically tears through the stored security footage. Nothing. No breaches. Like, they don't know who these people are. They don't know what they want. But our narrator is now burdened with a horrifying certainty. A network of people has been obsessively watching them, tracking them, and stalking them across the globe for over a decade. And the most terrifying thought of all, the narrator believes this is only the beginning. Like, they are convinced. Things are about to escalate. Tale 2. The Trail of Scents. A low, droning bass note fades in, accompanied by the subtle crunch of gravel under boots. Our second account takes us away from the claustrophobia of the suburbs and plunges us into the vast, isolating expanse of nature. For many of us, the wilderness is a sanctuary, a place to bleed off the stress of modern life. Our next narrator lives near the Angeles National Forest in California. If you know that terrain, you know it's rugged, beautiful, and unapologetically wild. This narrator is a seasoned hiker. Like, they know the trails like the back of their hand. Like, they don't fear the woods. They respect them. Why, one particular day, the narrator receives a phone call. It's bad news. The kind of heavy, life-altering news that makes the walls of your house feel like they're slowly crushing you. The kind of news that demands you move your body just to remind yourself you're alive. Some people pour a stiff drink. Some people call their best friend to cry. Our narrator laces up their boots. It's around 8. Light 0 p.m. when they hit the trailhead. The sun has already dipped below the horizon, but night hikes are a familiar routine for them. The goal isn't a grueling workout. It's exhaustion. They just want to tire their body out enough to guarantee sleep. The weather at elevation, however, is notoriously fickle. The narrator had checked the forecast, but by the time they are a mile in, a thick, suffocating fog rolls through the trees. And I don't mean a light mist. I mean a dense, soupy, claustrophobic gray wall. Visibility instantly drops to a mere 20 feet. The world beyond that radius simply ceases to exist. The narrator clicks on their heavy-duty flashlight, but it's a mistake. The intense beam hits the moisture suspended in the air and violently reflects back into their eyes, completely blinding them. It's like throwing your high beams on in a blizzard. Realizing it's useless, they click the light off, opting to let their eyes adjust to the muted, ambient gloom in. To keep the bears and mountain lions at bay, a trick learned from their father, the narrator plays music from a small speaker on their pack. Just a steady, rhythmic noise to announce their presence to the wildlife. About an hour deep into the hike, Surrounded by the dripping, silent fog, the narrator notices something strange. A smell. They actually stop dead in their tracks, the gravel crunching to a halt beneath their boots. It's incredibly faint, but amidst the crisp scent of pine and damp earth, it hits their olfactory senses like a physical blow. It's perfume. A distinct, floral, deeply unnatural scent hanging heavily in the cold mountain air. The narrator turns, squinting into the impenetrable 20-foot bubble of visibility, but there is nothing. Just gray. By the time they finish scanning the perimeter, the scent has evaporated. Weird, they think, shaking their head, attributing it to a phantom breeze from a distant road. They keep walking. 10 minutes later, a second smell. This one is more aggressive, but far more contextual. Like a campfire. The narrator exhales, the tension leaving their shoulders. Okay, they reason. Someone has pitched a tent-off trail out here. That explains the smoke, and honestly, it probably explains the perfume. Just some campers. But the smoke scent behaves exactly like the perfume. It lingers strongly for about 30 seconds, and then it is instantly, completely gone. There's no lingering haze, no directional shift in the wind. Just on, and then off. It isn't until the third scent hits that the narrator's primal instincts begin to scream. It's an herbal, earthy, deeply specific smell. The narrator's brain short-circuits as it recognizes the scent instantly from their childhood, though they can't attach a name or a memory to it. It's the sheer familiarity of it, juxtaposed against the absolute isolation of a dark, foggy mountain, that sends a shiver down their spine. Like, they know in their gut they should turn around. The woods have changed. The atmosphere has soured. But they don't. They keep pushing forward. Eventually, a false sense of calm settles over them. The rhythmic crunch of their boots, the music playing from their pack. They convince themselves they are just hyper-vigilant from the bad news earlier in the day. And then, they look to their left. Run parallel to the main trail, about 100 feet higher in elevation, is a jagged, steep ridge. The narrator knows this map intimately. There are absolutely no marked trails up there. To reach that ridge, you would have to violently bushwhack through impenetrable, dangerous brush in the pitch black. Yet, cutting through the fog high above them, is the unmistakable beam of a flashlight. It sweeps over the rocks, sharp and white. It clicks off. A few agonizing seconds pass in darkness. Then, 50 feet further up the ridge, it clicks on again. Sweeps. Clicks off. Someone is up there, pacing them. The narrator's blood turns to ice. Suddenly, the music blaring from their backpack doesn't feel like a deterrent for animals. It feels like a beacon for a hunter. They scramble to kill the audio, plunging themselves into the oppressive silence of the mountain. They strain their ears, listening desperately into the fog. And they hear it. Floating down from the ridge, piercing the heavy, damp air, is the sound of a human whistling. It's a casual, rhythmic tune, and the narrator realizes with horrifying clarity, if I can hear them whistling, they could absolutely hear my music. They are several miles deep. But the smart play is to turn back immediately, but fear makes us seek shelter. The narrator remembers a small, flat overlooked spot just up ahead. A place with their back to the void, where they can sit, assess the situation, and strategize a retreat. They hurry to the overlook, but as they break through the tree line into the clearing, their heart drops into their stomach. Sitting dead center on a large, flat rock at the edge of the overlook is a sculpture. Not a natural formation, a deliberate, meticulously stacked tower of stones. It wasn't their last time. It's a marker, a sign. The narrator doesn't sit. They don't rest. They pivot on their heel, pure adrenaline flooding their system, and begin the long, terrifying trek back to the car. But they barely take 5 steps before the silence of the forest is violently shattered. From the dense fog directly in front of them, from the exact path they need to take to get home, comes the sound of footsteps. Rapid, heavy, human, sprinting directly toward them. The narrator doesn't even have time to scream. They don't have time to run. The footsteps cover the distance with terrifying speed, the crunching of gravel growing deafeningly loud. The narrator braces for a physical impact, throwing their hands up to fight. And then, the footsteps stop. Right on top of them, barely an arm's length away in the fog. Complete, absolute, dead silence. The narrator stares frantically into the gray wall. They can't see a silhouette. They catch their breathing. It defies physics. How could someone charge them so aggressively, completely blind in the fog, and know exactly when to stop? Slowly, with trembling hands, the narrator reaches into their pocket and snaps open a switchblade. The metallic snick echoes loudly. They hold their ground, weapon raised, waiting for the swing, waiting for the tackle. Nothing, just the oppressive, wet silence. White, minutes stretch into eternity. The narrator is trapped. They don't want to speak and give away their exact coordinates, but they know the predator is right there. And the worst part, the unseen entity is blocking the only path out. If the narrator wants to survive, they have to walk directly into the space where the footsteps stop. With no other option, gripping the knife so hard their knuckles turn white, they step forward. Light. They brace for a knife in the dark, hands grabbing their throat. But they walk through empty air. The deeper into the fog they go, the more their brain tries to rationalize. Maybe they ran off on the soft dirt. Maybe I imagine the proximity. But the paranoia is an agonizing, physical weight. For the next mile, the narrator is subjected to psychological torture. Every few minutes, amidst the sound of their own frantic footsteps, they hear it. Crunch. An extra footstep, just behind them. But, matching their pace. Bite. They whip around, knife raised, staring into the gray abyss. Nothing. They turn back. White. Crunch. It lasts for a full mile. The most terrifying, prolonged anxiety of their entire life. They are being herded, stalked, played with. And then, the game ends. From the dense brush just behind them, a massive, violent crash erupts. It is so loud, so violently sudden, that the narrator physically jumps off the ground. The sheer terror bypasses their brain completely, and they let out a raw, involuntary scream into the dark. They turn. The bushes are shaking, but the fog hides the monster. The narrator breaks. But they turn and sprint. Like they run with a reckless, blind terror, completely abandoning any caution. They don't care about the rocks, or the fog, or the darkness. They just run. And as they sprint down the mountain, their lungs burning, their legs aching, like they can hear the heavy, crashing pursuit tearing through the brush directly behind them. They don't stop. They don't look back. They burst into the trailhead parking lot, hurl themselves into their car, lock the doors, and speed away into the night. They never found out what was on that mountain. They didn't hike again for months. But whatever it was, it had used the dark, the fog, and the isolation to show them exactly how vulnerable they truly were. Tale 3. The pacing in the dark. The sound of a heavy, wooden floor creaking underweight. A grandfather clock ticks slowly in the background. For our final story tonight, we step out of the woods and travel back in time, about 20 years, to the bitter, cold landscape of upstate Vermont. Our narrator is 15 years old. It's a terrible time in their life. Their parents are entrenched in a brutal, ugly, seemingly endless divorce. The house is a war zone of shouting matches and shattered plates. To spare the teenager the psychological crossfire while the lawyers sort out the wreckage, the mother makes a decision. The narrator is being shipped off to spend a few weeks with Great Aunt Lucy. The narrator is miserable, sent to live with a relative they barely know, in a place they've never been. Aunt Lucy is an eccentric, stern woman who lives in a colossal, imposing Victorian home. Sometime in the 1960s, she had inherited the sprawling estate and converted it into a multi-family building. She rents out the massive second and third floors to tenants, while she occupies the labyrinthine first-floor apartment. The house is like a movie set, towering ceilings, ornate, hand-carved moldings around the door frames, and those impossibly creaky, original hardwood floors that announce every shift in weight. But immediately upon arrival, the teenager notices something profoundly bizarre about Aunt Lucy's living arrangements. She has a stunning, cavernous master bedroom. It features tall, sweeping windows and gorgeous, antique furniture, but she doesn't sleep in it. The bed is perfectly made, untouched. Instead, Aunt Lucy sleeps on a small, cramped cot in a tiny, windowless den located just off the main living room. When the teenager asks why she avoids the beautiful bedroom, Aunt Lucy's face hardens. She offers a dismissive, flimsy excuse. It gets too much morning light. The teenager, possessing that blunt logic of youth, replies, "Can I sleep in there?" Then, Aunt Lucy shoots them a glare so withering, so laced with silent fury, that the 15-year-old instantly drops it. Back in those days, you didn't press your elders. You held your tongue. The teenager is given a different room, and on their very first night, lying in the dark, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, the nightmare begins. Right above their head, on the second floor. Thud, bite, thud, thud. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, but it isn't the sound of someone simply walking to the kitchen for a glass of water. It is methodical, a slow, rhythmic pacing. It starts at the front of the apartment, walks the entire length of the floorboards to the back, pauses, and then walks all the way back to the front. Over and over and over again. The teenager pulls the covers up to their chin. It's just a tenant, they rationalize. Someone who works the graveyard shift. An insomniac. But the pacing continues every single night. For a week, the teenager lays awake, listening to the pendulum swing of those heavy boots right above their face. Finally, over breakfast, exhausted and irritated, the teenager brings it up. "Aunt Lucy," they say. "The person upstairs walks around all night. It's really loud." Aunt Lucy stops chewing. She gives the teenager that same, chilling look from the first day. "The second floor is vacant," she says flatly. "It has been for over a month." The teenager shakes their head. "No. I hear someone walking up there every night, back and forth. It's an old house." And Lucy snaps, "You are hearing the building settling. Eat your eggs." But the teenager knows the difference between settling wood and a human stride. The next morning, fueled by a mix of fear and rebellion, they demand Aunt Lucy show them the vacant apartment. Lucy resists, visibly agitated, but the teenager relentlessly presses until she finally relents, snatching a ring of brass keys from the counter. They walk up the grand staircase. Lucy unlocks the heavy oak door. Just as she claimed, the second floor apartment is completely, utterly empty. Not a stick of furniture. Dust motes dance in the shafts of sunlight pouring through the windows. But as the teenager walks into the center of the vast living room, their eyes drop to the original hardwood floor. There, etched deeply into the polished wood, are scuff marks. Thick, black, fresh scuff marks. They aren't random. They form a distinct, undeniable path. A perfect, straight line leading from the front window all the way to the back wall. It is the exact, precise route the teenager has been listening to every single night. "Look," the teenager says, pointing to the floor, a cold dread washing over them. "Might. Someone has been walking here, over and over." Aunt Lucy barely glances at it. It's from the previous tenants moving their furniture. "Aunt Lucy, those are shoe scuffs. They're fresh. Lucy's jaw clenches. She grabs the teenager by the arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and pulls them out of the apartment, locking the door firmly behind them. She speaks to them like a babbling, irrational child. Enough of this nonsense. That evening, in a rare display of affection, Aunt Lucy suggests they sit in the living room and watch a movie together. The teenager agrees, hoping to ease the tension. They are halfway through the film. It's late. And then, it starts. Thud. 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 Right above them. The methodical pacing. The weight of a full-grown human being walking the length of the empty room. The teenager freezes. They slowly turn their head to look at Aunt Lucy, expecting her to finally widen her eyes, expecting her to leap up, grab the phone, call the police. The evidence is undeniable. It is happening right now, above their heads. Aunt Lucy doesn't look up. She doesn't flinch. Instead, her face completely blank, she reaches for the remote control and steadily turns the volume of the television up, drowning out the ceiling. A profound, sickening realization hits the 15-year-old like a physical blow. She isn't deaf. She isn't in denial. She knows exactly who is up there. The next morning, terrified and desperate, the teenager uses the rotary phone in the kitchen to call their mother back home. "Mike." They whisper frantically into the receiver, explaining the footsteps, the scuff marks, and Lucy's horrifying reaction. They expect their mother to demand they pack their bags. Instead, there is a long, heavy silence on the line. When the mother finally speaks, her voice is strained, guarded, and terrifyingly cold. "Do not bring the footsteps up with your aunt again," she says. "It is a very, sensitive topic." The mother hangs up. The teenager is completely on their own, trapped in a house with an aunt who is harboring a phantom, and a mother who is complicit in the silence. The dread culminates a few nights later, near the end of the dreadful visit. The teenager wakes up around 0 a.m. Nature calls. They slip out of their bedroom, navigating the dark hallway toward the bathroom. As they pass the grand staircase leading to the second floor, they glance up. The heavy oak door at the top of the stairs, the door Aunt Lucy had locked tight, is cracked open, just a few inches. Spilling through that crack, moving with the rhythmic sway of a walking human, is the faint, pale beam of a flashlight. Someone is awake. Someone is walking. Someone is living in the empty apartment. The teenager doesn't use the bathroom. They sprint back to their room, shove a chair under the doorknob, and pray for daylight. If they hadn't been sitting next to Aunt Lucy during the movie, they would have assumed she was the one walking. But they knew, for a fact, there was a third person in that house. When the teenager finally returned home, the mother absolutely refused to speak about it. The questions were met with screaming matches. The secret caused a massive, permanent rift between them. It wasn't until years later, as an adult, that our narrator finally got a sliver of the truth. At a family gathering, a cousin pulled them aside. They revealed that Aunt Lucy had abruptly sold the massive Victorian house and fled to Florida. The cousin, after a few drinks, leaned in and spilled the family secret. Back in the 1992, shortly after Lucy inherited the building, there was an incident in the second-floor apartment. Someone died. The circumstances were incredibly dark, utterly unclear, and deeply scandalous. The family rallied together, threw money at the problem and managed to keep it completely out of the papers. They buried the truth. Our narrator ends their letter with this: I have never believed in ghosts. I think the supernatural is a lazy way to interpret things that terrify us. When I think back on that heavy pacing, the scuff marks, the beam of the flashlight. Wait. I know it was flesh and blood. Maybe Aunt Lucy was sheltering a criminal relative who needed to stay off the grid. Maybe someone was blackmailing her, forcing her to provide a safe house in exchange for keeping the death in the 90 seconds a secret. Maybe whoever caused that death never actually left. I don't know. I will never notice it before that night. I know my mother knows. And I will never forgive her for letting me sleep in that house. Elohim fades back in, swelling slightly before dropping back to a whisper. 3 stories. 3 instances of the veil being pulled back, revealing the watchers in the dark. Whether it's a convoy of cars casing your childhood home, an unseen predator hurting you through the fog, or a dark family secret pacing the floorboards, right above your head. Wait. The lesson remains the same. We are never as alone as we think we are. Thank you for listening. Light, lock your doors tonight, and we'll see you next time in the dark.